Okay, so today I want to talk to you about social network graphs. I'm going to divide this into two lectures. We're going to talk in the first place about social network graph anonymization, and then we talk about de-anonymization attacks. So we look at anonymization in general, some approaches, and how they work. Okay. So anonymity is basically to try to make users indistinguishable from each other. So for example, if you create a group of friends and you have inside of the group subgroups, for example, that have your really close friends and then your not so really close friends, you want to give the impression to all of the body of your friends that they are being treated equally, but to be able to have these private forms of communication just because that is how we are made up as human beings. However, you want to do this also to avoid your friends being targeted. So you want, for example, to protect them from being used as targets to draw information about your person. So if you're discussing private things with a particular group of friends, you want to make sure that this communication is hidden or not known to other people who are outside of this circle of friends. And you want to hide this because you want to hide, for example, demographic information. Demographic information is everything about yourself, so your name, your date of birth, and so on, things that define you in a unique way. And you want to do this to ensure that the anonymization works so that you have your trusted circle of friends, and also to avoid issues like we just talked about of spread of malware, of spread of scam, of identity theft, of spoofing, and so on. Okay. So the nice thing, for example, about Facebook is that it allows you to have these different levels of trust. I talk about Facebook because it has defined that quite nicely. You have categories of trust that you can define. So think about what we said, for example, when we talked about privacy settings, when we talked about, for example, access control policies, and the way that you can categorize friends into different groups in order to define different levels of trust. Okay. The reason that you want to do this, and that I talk about this example first from 2010 and then the example of the Butterfly botnet from 2012, is that, as I have said before, social media platforms are a great place to collect personal information. And sometimes it is quite easy. So for example, in 2010, Ron Bowles collected with some program some personal data of Facebook. So basically he just crawled Facebook and collected personal data about people who were using Facebook, and then published this data on Pirate Bay. Pirate Bay is a public file sharing site. Okay, so basically by just using this small program that he had deduced, he was able to collect a lot of private data. And the reason that he's able to collect this private data is because, first of all, people do things like forgetting to set privacy settings, forgetting to define strong passwords, forgetting to define proper access control policies, forgetting about things like transitive disclosures that lead to the divulging or the publishing of information that they would not otherwise want to make public. And then in 2015, the Butterfly botnet, powered by the Yahoo's virus, built again on this idea of social engineering, which has worked nicely for social media platforms because it allows us to collaborate, to share information, but also allows people wanting to collect information about our behaviors, about the things we do, about sometimes the things we don't even know about ourselves. This allows these people to be able to thrive on these platforms to collect information about our person. So basically what happened with the Yahoo's virus was that one user, for example, gets infected because maybe, for example, they accepted a photograph or they accepted a message. They send this message, for example, to all of their friends. So a network is created, a network of friends is created, and a network of infected users is also created. And the message that the user was received and that he sends or he or she sends around and that forms this network had attached to it a malicious file or link that users clicked on, and that resulted in a number of unpleasant situations on their social media platforms. So in the theoretical sense, when social media platforms allow you to anonymize friendship networks, to anonymize friendship groups, basically they are operating on, there are several methods, but we talk about two. They are operating on one of these two concepts. So one is clustering and one is the modification of the graph. Conceptually, what clustering does is that it will group together all of the sets of users that you want to have into one single subgraph. So think about, for example, your big group of friends and then the subgroups that you define, for example, for your really close friends and then for your not so really close friends and so on, okay? And then you form a cluster, which is basically, as I have on the graph there, to say, for example, that this cluster, which is circled by the blue dotted lines, is my network of really close friends, and the rest are outside of this group. How you see this, for example, on some social media platform is when you say, this is this group of friends that I have, and I chalk in the people whom I want. So think about your friends as being one of these red dots that I have on this graph. Okay. And then basically what you have then is that this subgraph cluster should appear as some group that you know about, but that everybody else who is outside of your profile does not know about. Okay. So what happens, so that was clustering. What can happen, or another approach that you can have, is that of graph modification, for example. With graph modification, what happens is that you pretend to add in other edges to modify the structure of the graph. So think about, for example, you have your circle of really good friends, okay, as we talked about in the previous slide. Then what you want to do is to create links that are unnatural. So you might pretend, for example, that one of your friends who is friends only to you is also friends to some other close friend that you have in your circle in your subgroup of friends, and so on. And the reason that you do this is because you want to create some perception to the outside that this information, this group of people that you have are communicating in ways that are not really true to the outside, but that you know about internally. Okay. You can also have random graph modifications, so you could pretend to destroy the link between two friends. So for example, you could have two friends who are friends outside of your little subgraph, but who are not friends within your little subgraph. So for example, we talked about the fact that you can create unnatural connections. You can also, for example, create other artificial connections to give the impression that these friends are not connected in the ways that you that are indicated to the outside. The reason that we do all of this is because we want to reduce the possibility of the person who is trying to spread, for example, malware, from spreading malware to people whom we know or like, or from spreading malware to people who are able to connect to this circle of trusted friends. Okay. You can also have greedy graph modifications in which you choose specifically what links to connect or not to connect. Okay. And so, for example, as I have at the end here, you could decide instead of doing what we had before, which was to have this, instead what you would have is this, where this node is not connected to anybody in the graph, but that artificially exists. So next time what we want to talk about is this, how these social network graphs are de-anonymized. So what I was saying basically was that you have your social network graph. You want to create circles of friends that are trusted, and you want to create circles to, for example, if you decide to add in artificial nodes, to give to artificial friends, to give the impression that this circle of trusted friends is actually bigger than it actually is, in order to deceive or to give the adversary the impression that the subgraph that you have is something that it really isn't. The reason that you want to do this is to be able to detect if some malware or if some scam is being spread, and to be able to stop it before it goes around all of the circle of friends that you have. So anonymization is basically to allow you to protect yourself progressively or in some structured way from de-anonymization attacks that appear in the form, for example, of malware, in the form of scam, in the form, for example, of people phishing for information that they're going to want to use, for example, for identity theft. In the next point, when I talk about de-anonymization, what I want to show you is how, in spite of those tricks that you develop, people or adversaries find ways to de-anonymize the social network graph. I reiterate again that the methods of anonymization that we looked at are clustering, where, for example, you develop a little group, which is the more natural way to do this, of your circle of really trusted friends, and the more unnatural way of doing this by modifying the graph, either by creating links, unnatural links to different friends inside of your subgraph or inside of your group, or adding in friends that you have created who are actually people who don't exist, but people who give the impression that they belong to your special subgraph, and that allow you to be able to detect when, for example, you have cases of scam that are trying to, that some adversary is trying to want to spread in your group or in your subgraph.